In this lecture,
We'll be studying about User Operating System Interface.
Now, in the previous
When
lecture,
we studied about operating system services, we saw that user interface is one of the most important service that is
provided by the operating system.
Now, what is a user interface?
A user interface is something that allows
the user to actually interact with the operating system.
So in this lecture,
we'll be seeing a little bit more about the
user interfaces,
and we will see what are the approaches that allows the user to actually interact with the operating system.
Now, there are two fundamental approaches for users
to interface with your trading system.
Now, if you remember in the previous lecture,
we talked a little bit about this,
that there are two fundamental approaches for
the user to interface with your trading system.
The first one being the command line interface, or CLI. So the first approach is to provide a command line interface or a command interpreter that allows users to directly enter commands that are to be performed by the operating system. So this is the first approach,
in which we have something known as
the command line interface, or CLI, also known as the command interpreter,
in which the user have to enter the command
of the task that he wants to perform. So the command has to be entered in the CLI, and based on the command, the operating system will perform that task. So in this process, the user has to remember all the commands that he needs for performing certain task. And then the second approach is to allow the user to interface with your operating system via a graphical user interface, or GUI. So the graphical user interface is the most commonly used, as well as the most user-friendly kind of user interface, which you usually use in your day-to-day life. So in a graphical use interface,
what we have is we have your desktop with your menus.
And then using your mouse or your pointing devices, you can click on your menus, or using your keyboard, you can enter something, and in that way,
you interact with your operating system.
So even while you are watching this video, you got here
using your graphical user interface.
So these are the two fundamental approaches
for the users to interface with the operating system.
Now we'll be seeing a little
more
bit
in detail about the command line interfaces,
and then we will take an example of how to perform a certain task using the command line interface
in two different operating systems.
So I'll be showing you an example
in Linux operating system
and also in Windows operating system
in order to perform a certain task.
So as I already told you,
the command line interface is also
the
known
command
as
interpreter. And what happens is that some operating systems,
they include the command interpreter in the kernel. Now,
what is a kernel? The kernel is like the heart of your operating system.
So we'll be discussing more about kernel
as we move ahead in this lecture series. You must know that in some operating systems, the command interpreter is included in the kernel itself, whereas in others, such as Windows, XP, and Unix, they treat the command interpreter as a special program. So these are 2 points that you should remember, that in some operating systems,
the command interpreter is included in the kernel,
whereas in some operating systems,
it is treated as a special program.
Now you must have already
known about the command interpreters
in different operating systems.
Like in your Windows,
you have the command prompt,
also known as a CM sometimes.
And in your Linux, you have a program known as terminal,
which allows you to interact with the CLI.
So I'll be showing you those examples later on.
Now on some systems with multiple
command interpreters to choose from,
the interpreters are known as shells.
Now on some systems,
you may have multiple
command interpreters from which you can choose,
and the interpreters are known as shells.
For example,
you have the Bone shell, the C shell,
or the Bone,
again shell,
also known as bash.
You must have come across this
BASH,
which stands for the bone,
again shell,
and the corn shell, etc.
So these are some
of
the
examples of shells that you have.
Now the question
is, how does
the command interpreter actually perform the task
that you enter
using a command? So there are 2
approaches in which
command interpreter actually executes a task. So in the first approach, what happens is that the code for performing a certain task is included in the command interpreter itself. So let's say that you want to perform a certain task, and the task could be anything.
There are many tasks
you can perform,
like creating a file,
deleting a file,
copying or moving a file,
renaming a file,
or executing a file, and so on.
There are many kind of
tasks that you may want to perform.
Now let's say
you want to perform a task of creating a file.
Now in the first approach,
we said that
the command interpreter itself, it contains the code for performing the certain task. Now when you enter
the command
for creating a file, what happens is, the code for creating the file is contained in the command interpreter itself. So that code will be executed from the command interpreter itself when you try to create a new file. Now the second approach is that the command interpreter itself does not contain any codes, but the codes are written in certain programs. So there are certain programs which are responsible for performing certain tasks, and the command interpreter, what it does is that it will just call the program based on the command that you enter. So the command interpreter itself does not understand or does not know how to execute that command that you enter. So let's say that you want to create a file again. So in the second approach, you enter the command for creating a file. So the command interpreter, what it will do is that it is not going to run that call from itself because it does not have any call itself. So what it will do is it will call that program which is responsible for creating a file. So that is how the second approach works. So in the first approach, the code is contained in the command interpreter itself. And in the second approach, the codes are contained in certain programs. And the command interpreter just calls the programs when a certain task has to be performed, when a command is entered. So that is how the command interpreter works. Now I will show you an example of using the command interpreter or the command line interfaces in two different operating systems. So let's say that we have a small task of just creating two directories, and also we want to delete those directories after we created them. So I will be showing you how we can use the CLI in Linux Mint, and also how we can use the CLI in Windows to perform this small task. So here I am on a Linux Mint operating system, which is an Ubuntu-based operating system. And as you see, this is the desktop of my Linux Mint. And now we will see how we can use the terminal in order to interact with the shell and perform a certain task. And say that the simple task that we want to perform is to create a directory on this desktop and then to delete that same directory. So first of all, what you have to do is you have to open your terminal. So in order to open your terminal, you can press Ctrl-Alt-D on your keyboard. And then when you press that, the terminal gets opened up for you, which looks something like this. So here the first thing that you see is your username, followed by the computer name or your host name after this address symbol. So the first thing that we need to do here is we need to go to the desktop because we are going to create the directory on our desktop. And right now, we are not on the desktop. So in order to check where you are right now, if you want to know your present location, there is a command called buttleutl, which means print working directory. So if you press enter, it will show you what is your current location. So here you are in home Nesto, and you are not on the desktop. So we need to go to the desktop. So in order to go to, there is a command called cd, which means change directory. And then you have to type desktop, and when you press enter, you now enter the desktop. Now you can check again by typing pud, which brings your present working directory. And here now, you are on the desktop now. Here we want to create a directory. Now in order to create a directory, there is a command called mkdir, which stands for make directory, and followed by space. You have to give the name of your directory. So let me just call it myfile1. And when I press enter, the myfile1 directory gets created on the desktop. Now if you want to see what are the contents your desktop, there is a command called ls, which means list, and if you press enter, you will see that myfile1 is present on the desktop. So I can minimize my terminal and show myfile1 is created on the desktop. Now let's say we want to create one more file in that same way, mkdir, and I call it myfile2. So if I press enter again, and if I list out my files again on the next stop, you see that myfile1 and myfile2 are created on the next stop. So here we see myfile1 and myfile2. Alright, now we want to delete this myfile1 and myfile2. So in order to delete this, there is another command called rm, which means remove, and followed by -rf. Now this autumn is used to delete files, and if you want to delete directories, you have to give this extra command called -rf and then space, and you have to give the name of your file. So let's say I want to delete my file1, which is a name of our file, and when I press enter, my file1 will now be deleted. Now if I try to list out my files on the desktop by using the ls command U, see that only my file 2 is present now because we have deleted my file1. So let's go and see the next stop. My file1 is gone, only my file 2 is present. Now you can do for my file 2 as well, rm-rf my file 2. And if you press enter and if you list out, you see there is nothing on the desktop now, and both my file1 and my file 2 gets deleted. So that is how you can perform task using the terminal. So this is just a simple example of using the terminal in Linux. Now let us try to perform the same task in Windows. So here I am on a Windows 7 operating system, and in order to do the same thing that we did in Linux, in Windows what we have to do is we have to go to your start menu and type cmd. And click on CM, which is your command prompt, and this is the command line interface for Windows. So what we are going to do is going to create 2 directories, my file1, my file2 on desktop, and then we will delete them. So first of all, what we have to do is have to go to the desktop. So right now, this is the location which we are. C users Nestle. So we have to go to the desktop for that. We will type the same command cd, which means change to the tree, and then next stop now. When you press enter, you enter the desktop now. In order to make the files or to create the directory, what we will do is we will use a command called mkdir, which means make directory, and then the name of our file, so which I will call my file1. So when you press enter, you see that my file is created on the desktop, and if you want to make another file, my file 2, use the same command, and my file 2 gets created. Now if you want to see the contents of the desktop, you can type dir. So in Linux, we used ls, so in Windows you're using dir. So if you press enter, you can see these are the files present on the desktop, my file1 and my file 2, which are these 2, and new folder is the one which already present before. Alright, now we want to delete my file 1 and my file 2. So for that, we will use a command called rmdir, which means remove directory, and then followed by the name of your directory. That is my file 1. So if you press enter, you see that my file 1 gets deleted. And if you want to do the same thing for my file 2, you can type rmdir my file 2. So my file 2 also gets deleted. So that is how you use the command prompt in order to do the same thing that we just did in Linux. So if you want to do the same thing using graphical user interface, it's very easy. You already know how to do it. Just right click and go to new and go to folder and give the name of your folder, and then your data gets created. So it's very easy how to do using graphical user interface. You used to do it almost every day in your day life, and if you want to delete it, it's very easy. Just right click again and go to delete, and then it's get deleted. Or you can just select it and press delete on your keyboard, and in that way or so it gets deleted. So that is how user friendly and easy it is to use the graphical user interface. And we have also seen how to do the same thing using command line interface. So in those examples, we saw how we can use the command interface to perform certain tasks in Windows as well as in Linux. And also we saw a small demo of the graphical user interface. So I hope this examples help to understand how the user actually interacts with the operating system using this user operating system interfaces. So I hope this was clear too. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.